Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to participants joining us from all over the world. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this session, Aligning Trade and Climate Policy for the Least Developed Countries and Graduates. Today's discussion is co-hosted by leading think tanks ODI and IIED, alongside the Enhanced Integrated Framework of the World Trade Organization. I'm Sarah Collin-Brander, and I lead the Climate and Sustainability Program at ODI. Let me start by congratulating three countries, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Laos. The United Nations has just marked these three countries as eligible to graduate from the least developed country category by 2026. This progress reflects years of careful policymaking and investment to reduce poverty, diversify economic activity, and enhance resilience to shocks of all kinds. The LDCs receive preferential treatment under the global climate and the global trade architecture. For example, LDC exporters have privileged access to major markets such as the European Union and United States. LDCs also have a dedicated multilateral climate fund, and their finance flowing from other climate funds to LDCs and SIDS is measured and recorded to ensure they are receiving an appropriate proportion. While graduation from the least developed country status marks huge economic and social progress, it also exposes graduates to risks after the loss of international support measures. ODI, IIED, and EIF have been working together over the last 6 months to support LDC climate and trade negotiators as they think through opportunities to align their climate and trade strategies. The LDCs and forthcoming graduates face an unprecedented development challenge, raising living standards within increasingly stringent carbon budgets while adapting to the physical and transition risks of climate change. Given the importance of international trade in providing a path out of extreme poverty, our shared vision is that the LDCs will be able to diversify their economies and build their productive capacities in a way that is also compatible with new climate constraints. Please do check out our recent work on concessional finance, carbon markets, and technology transfer with the LDC groups. However, to date, we have not yet had an opportunity to consider how climate and trade agendas will need to come together for the LDC graduates, and that is the particular focus of today's discussion. It is my great pleasure to welcome our esteemed panel. Ratnaka Adhikari is the Executive Director of the Enhanced Integrated Framework. Laura Kelly is the Director of the Shaping Sustainable Markets team at IIED, and Dr. Jody is a Senior Research Fellow at ODI. These three speakers will be considering some of the challenges and opportunities with securing smooth transition strategies for LDC graduates, particularly on the climate and trade fronts. Unfortunately, our fourth panelist, Dr. Salim Al-Haq, Director of the International Centre for Climate Change and Development, who has been an important partner in all our conversations so far, is unable to join us at the last minute. We were hoping to have Ratnaka, originally from Nepal, and Salim from Bangladesh, representing two of the forthcoming LDC graduates in this discussion. However, given Salim's absence and Ratnaka's global work, we look forward to hearing examples from a whole range of different countries. So thank you to our speakers, and thank you to you, our audience, for joining us today. First, we will go around each of our three speakers and give them a chance to discuss the challenges and opportunities that LDCs and particularly LDC graduates face in the wake of COP26 and in the advent of the 12th WTO Ministerial Conference. Let me turn first to you, Ratnaka. Of course, the 12th Ministerial Conference has been postponed due to the new variant, but we'd love your thoughts on how trade ministers should be engaging with climate change and the LDCs.
Just give me a second. Thank you very much, Sarah, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are participating from. So to respond to your question, as you rightly mentioned, the MC12 may now take place in 2022, which gives some time to take a stock of COP26 and focus on key aspects of synergy on nexus between trade and climate change. Arising from COP26 negotiation, there were some signs of breakthrough that can further help move from words to action. And this is very, very important in the context of LDCs, for the benefit of LDCs, particularly on finance, which is where the LDCs have been focusing on, the entire negotiating energy. I mean, not entire, but then major portion of their negotiating energy has been focused on finance. But we've seen some good development at COP26. One is likely mobilization of up to 500,000 billion over the period of 2021 and 2025. I emphasize the word likely because there are few ifs and buts. If those ifs and buts can be managed, then there will probably be 500 billion available. Then the second one is the new task force on climate finance, co-chaired by the UK and Fiji, that includes LDCs such as Bangladesh, Rwanda, and Uganda to benefit as pioneer countries. Then the third one is the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, launched at COP26 to accelerate investment in green energy transitions and renewable power solutions in developing countries. And that would definitely include some of the least developed countries as well as some of the ones that are in the process of graduating. So within the WTO context, three platforms and mechanisms are noteworthy. And I would like to start with the Trade and Environment Sustainability Structured Discussion, TESD, which functions as a non-committal incubator for ideas. And more LDCs could consider joining this discussion from 2022, build on the work we have hopefully helped to catalyze. Second is the WTO Committee on Trade and Environment. The most important part of this is that there's a considerable traction amongst LDC to join discussion in the WTO Committee on Trade and Environment. So this is a very useful platform for LDCs to engage on these issues. Then on a practical level, the EIF will be exploring ways to further integrate climate change support into our program as demanded by LDCs. We can support through capacity building support, productive capacity building projects with focus on green value chain, analytical work such as diagnostic trade integration studies and project preparation grant that could be provided to countries to develop bankable projects which would enable them to mobilize resources, including from the climate finance instruments. So I just want to provide a few examples of our earlier intervention, and bringing some of the global experience, as Sarah, you rightly pointed out. In this example of Ethiopia is something that I want to emphasize. This is something that I'm presenting for the first time. So as a part of big value chain enhancement project that we've supported in Ethiopia, 4,400 bee for us seedlings have been planted by beneficiary youth population. And this would definitely have a significant impact, pretty positive impact on climate change. And something that was not initially, thought through. I'll come back to that a little later, but then, this is one of the byproduct of the project, I would say. And in Mali, and this is an old example, but then, for the benefit of those of you who might be listening into this discussion for the first time, what we've done is to support Mali to become a part of the Great Green Wall of Africa by planting 10,000 hectares of land with acacia tree, because the project that we supported in Mali relates to gum arabic, helping them to produce gum arabic, and the source of gum arabic are the acacia trees that are planted as a part of this initiative to halt the movement of desert, Sahara desert, right inside the country. Of course, it's already there, but then further movement. So that's another example. The third example, and this is probably the example that I'm providing for the first time, and this is based on a report that we've just read about a month ago, produced by UNSCAP. UNSCAP, what they did was to look at all the Asia Pacific states, the small island developing states, and to look at their trade facilitation indicator, particularly on the digital sort of trade facilitation indicator side of it. And then they rank Vanuatu as the #1 country, having met this, all the criteria. Almost 77% out of 100. I mean, that's a huge achievement for Vanuatu. The nearest competitor, being Fiji, is somewhere close to 60%, but they are 77%. What they did was basically through our support, national single window that we've supported to create, as a result of which they were able to start paperless, approval of the biosecurity certification, as a result of which 42,000 less pages of paper, down 95%, and 25,000 fewer trips, down 86% from the baseline figure, baseline being 2019. And this has resulted in Vanuatu securing this position. And just one indicator is that, this is just one indicator, is that just by reducing the paper consumption, they managed to reduce CO2 emission by 5,827 kgs through the paper, by reducing paperwork. But then there are other benefits. We have not even counted the benefits of the lower methane emission because of having prevented felling of trees, and then the trips, the less number of trips in order to certify, get the paperwork done. That would also result in significant reduction in CO2 emissions. And we'll probably have to do a study on how this has been achieved and what are the outcomes. So, and then finally, the final point is that the project that we are supporting, the IIED and ODI to implement. Basically, there are 3 papers that are being prepared that have been finalized actually, and then the discussion is happening with LDCs Group and who are involved in WTO negotiation as well as UNFCCC negotiation to come together and discuss the possible areas of synergy. And in relation to the papers, 3 papers, I would like to mention one sentence per paper. Of course, you'll hear more from others. Then on technology transfer, it's a lack of multilateral instrument on transfer technology, high cost, trade barriers, and social resistance, coupled with capacity constraints, have reduced the prospects of full utilization of potential of technology transfer, but there are ways to improve this. That's the #1. And in relation to carbon market, LDCs can benefit both from Article 6.2 and Article 6.4 mechanism on carbon market. But one of the significant challenges that the LDCs face is the increased trade costs due to carbon market adjustment mechanism that may hurt LDCs, and particularly the graduating LDCs, because they would anyway be losing preferential market access. And the third one on climate financing is that because of COVID-19 and continued fiscal squeeze, it means that climate change, climate actually finance is even more important. And aid for trade has a very important role to play in catalyzing such finances, including the private sector finance. I'll stop here. Thank you very much. We'll be happy to respond to questions later.
Thank you so much, Ratnaka. I'm sure everyone has questions. I have a whole lot, but I'm going to refrain from abusing my position as chair for the moment to invite Laura Kelly from IIED to provide some remarks. And particularly, Laura, Ratnaka began to allude to some of the outcomes of COP there around climate finance and technology transfer. We'd love to hear some more from you about whether you're optimistic, pessimistic about the prospects for climate smart trade for LDCs.
Great. Thank you, Sarah, and welcome to everyone who's joining us today from wherever in the world you are and wherever the time zone you're in. Yes, as Sarah says, the sort of what's the prognosis coming out of COP? Is it a glass half empty or a glass half full? If we look at some of the things that the LDCs had really pushed for in the run-up to the conference, finance, as Ratnaka was saying, was clearly one of them. And yes, there's been a renewed commitment to make new commitments and to meet the commitments, but those are commitments that are 10 years out of date. So it is a sort of a glass half empty, I think, in that sense. The other thing that we're sort of concerned about as an organisation working with the LDCs, and they themselves have highlighted, is the use of loans rather than grants. And obviously the private sector is absolutely crucial in providing the resources that we need to address climate change, but in some cases public finance is needed to provide the capacity building, for example, to support the ability to adapt and adopt technologies to local situations. So that's an important area that probably, you know, COP didn't go as far as it could have done. There are opportunities for blending finance, bringing together public and private finance in a very sort of concerted way, and perhaps I'll say a little bit more on that later. The other area obviously was around cuts to CO2 emissions to keep us within the sort of the 1.5 trajectory. You know, the hashtag that was really trending through the second week of COP was keep 1.5 alive. I think the prognosis is that it's on life support, though the fact that it was agreed that countries would come back each year with renewed commitments, a sort of a ratchet mechanism, I think is a really positive development. And actually many LDCs themselves are really showing leadership in this space, and I think that's what's incredibly positive. Country like Bangladesh, Salim isn't here to talk about it, but they have set their own net zero target for 2050. And to support that, they've actually got a really strong comprehensive green growth program. And they're not just talking about green growth, they're talking about inclusive growth. They're thinking about bringing in the poorest households, bringing in women. And I think going back to what Ratna was saying about concrete projects on the ground, that's where these kinds of things are really important, that the poorest are included, because they're often the ones that are hit the most. And some of the work that we've done as IID in Bangladesh shows that at the household level, there's expenditure already of about $2 billion a year on coping with climate change, be that if you've lost your crop due to flooding, or you can't get to market, people not being able to get to work because of bad weather, or changes to your access to solar energy, those sorts of things. So there is a huge impact here for the poorest, even within the least developed countries. So finding ways to ensure that they are supported to adapt and to build their resilience is key, and particularly for countries like Nepal, Bangladesh that are graduating, that the concessional finance that they might have access to, the trade preferences, that the removal of those doesn't undermine some of those efforts. And then the actual commitments made by developed and emerging economies to cut their CO2 emissions. So the issue of coal, fossil fuels came onto the agenda at COP in a way that it hadn't before. And while the commitments to phase out coal did not make it through the last few days, and we had pictures of the UK President Alok Sharma in tears at one point, showing, I think, just how high stakes and how emotional this issue was. There are commitments in there to start to take steps to reduce use, and very concrete initiatives such as the one from the UK, the US, and Europe to support South Africa to move out of coal. Huge issues for South Africa in terms of a green and just transition, and not just South Africa, but countries in the region where migrant workers go to work in the coal mines. I think around about $8.5 billion was committed. That's really positive, but it's not just the miners and the jobs within the coal sector, it's the sectors that depend on that. So the supply industries, local communities where miners are based, where they may be living, where they may be eating. What's the impact on those parts of the economy going to be, and how can we, through linking together the climate and the trade agendas, think about the implications for those communities and their engagement in sustainable development. So I'll stop there and then perhaps come back with a little bit more detail and some responses on questions later. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Laura. I think it's really important to underscore your point about the constant leadership that the least developed countries have shown on climate change, but nonetheless, their ultimate dependency on some of the larger economies around them. I think there's a good example there with many of the southern African countries that depend on the power generated by South Africa and the prospects there for coal. Those of you who can pick up my accent will know that I'm Australian. The Pacific Islands and their relationship with Australia is another great example there, where a number of those would be categorized as LDCs, along with countries like Papua New Guinea. And there are real tensions now around Australia's unwillingness to phase out or phase down coal and the implications that has for its LDC and SIDS neighbours. So I think that's a really important theme in terms of trade, climate, and geopolitical and economic interdependency. Third, I'd like to move to Dr. Jody Keane. Jody, Laura threw down a gauntlet of glass is half full after COP26. Do you agree?
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you for everyone for joining us here this afternoon. I can see that we've got some great participants on the line, so I hope many of you will chip into these discussions. I think from my perspective at COP, we saw a lot of big announcements, a lot of focus on the big emitters, the big countries. And of course, this is to be expected, because the conference was really about securing big emissions reductions. But it does stand in contrast really to what we see within the trade discussions, and particularly the focus of the current DG, where, despite LDC's really very small shares of world trade, and which have declined since COVID, less than 1% at the current time, the group collectively accounts for this tiny share of world trade, but still the LDC Group does receive a lot of focus within the WTO discussions. We have had specific deliverables for LDCs in previous negotiations, and looking ahead to MC12, we're also looking for specific deliverables for LDCs and forthcoming graduates. But, none of this was on the radar at COP26. There was no LDC package at COP26. The issues around graduating LDCs, is just not on the area, on the radar. So I really do feel that this is really quite disappointing, because there are some concrete areas where LDCs specifically have raised concerns, and I'll pick up on some of these in the intervention. But I think the big point that I want to make really is that over time, the global trading system has learned that in order to make progress, it really needs to make sure that there are very specific gains for LDCs. And we've seen this in previous rounds of negotiations on rules of origin, on services. And we're looking ahead, for specific gains, focusing on LDCs and forthcoming graduates at MC12. So just this week, as part of the project that Ratnika mentioned, we had some conversations with LDC climate negotiators and trade negotiators, and we were reflecting on the outcomes of COP26. And unfortunately, there is this perception that, you only get something out of the climate change regime if you're a polluter. There's big announcements, big polluters, there's big packages for big polluters, but there isn't anything for LDCs that have really contributed, hardly made a dent to historical emissions and current emissions. So it's almost as if LDCs are being penalized for not being polluters, but they are looking for opportunities to leapfrog technologies, to access carbon markets, new sources of climate finance. But there are also some concerns that even though agreement was reached on Article 6 within the COP26, so agreement was reached on carbon markets and a framework has been set, there are still concerns around scale, the size of projects and the ability to attract investment and new sources of climate finance to help this kind of leapfrogging process. So, these are kind of typical issues really for small countries, and most LDCs are extremely small, notwithstanding Bangladesh as a forthcoming graduate. So I think that we do need to think quite carefully, and there are opportunities, I think, to learn from the trade regime as to how, to better support LDCs participate and really secure gains from trade, gains from the new architecture, the new framework that has been established by the COP26 process. Ratnika mentioned, and also Laura mentioned, the kind of new emphasis on climate finance. And I think this is great. It's great that a task force has been set up finally to, focus on the process of accessing climate finance. But I think it's still, this incremental progress that has been made, and really LDCs just don't have the luxury of waiting, for this incremental progress. As Laura mentioned, households are already spending, they're already losing resources, to adapt to climate change at the current time. So I do think it's this, LDCs just don't have the luxury of waiting. We don't really have the luxury of waiting, to think about how aid for trade can be greener, and then how climate finance can be better operationalized. We need to think now, within current timeframes, how they can work more effectively together within existing timeframes. We don't have the luxury, and we can't afford the risks that the carbon market that's going to be established, only goes, the only beneficiaries are the kind of bigger, larger countries, as we saw previously with the clean development mechanism. So, my perspective is, the glass is, I would say, I would err more on the glass is half empty. And I say we still have quite a long way still to go in order to better align climate and trade policy for the least developed countries.
Thank you very much, Jody, for those observations. And I just wanted to pick up on your point about the luxury of time not being with us anymore, and the inequities of who is getting finance in the face of climate crisis. I think a really striking thing that emerged from our previous conversations is that ultimately both climate finance and aid for trade, while very much appreciated, are small in the face of the magnitude of this challenge. And what the important thing about bringing this conversation together is that LDCs are looking for structural transformation for a climate changed world. And that requires something much more profound and ingrained than tinkering around the edges with small infrastructure investments or a bit of capacity building here and there. So I'm going to suggest now that we have just around 60 participants on the call. We would really welcome you adding some questions to the chat or putting your hand up to make comments. I'm not 100% sure if IISD can then bring you in to spotlight you, but please do put questions in as we navigate that process. And in parallel, while those questions are coming in, I'm going to ask each of Ratnika, Laura and Jody to tell us about the one priority that they see in either the climate or trade architecture to move this conversation forward for LDCs, and what would be the quickest win that they can see at this moment when there is so much energy around this agenda. So Ratnika, can I ask you to jump in first with your top priority?
Thank you. When you say one, actually, it becomes a bit challenging. So I would say, capacity building and coordination, and put them as one. So, when we talk about capacity, LDCs, and that we've realized working in the area of aid for trade already, right? So in the area of accessing climate finance, in the area of being able to utilize the technology that has been transferred, technology absorption would be even more important. Absorption would be even more important than technology transfer, right? At the end of the day, you have to be able to utilize it in order to achieve what what you mentioned as structural transformation. And there's something that I'm writing currently on technology and structural transformation, and there's a bit of a climate change element to it as well. So that's another, right? And then the thing that I mentioned earlier, in order to access climate finance, you need to develop bankable project, and you've seen that in the CDM, and this was mentioned by Jody, right? So in the case of CDM, the prime suspects, bigger developing countries were the ones who sort of utilize the mechanism, and they will probably continue to utilize the mechanism of Article 6, 6.2 as well. So And unless and until you're able to build those, credible and bankable projects, you will not be able to access finance, right? So therefore, we have to build their capacity to prepare those projects. One way of doing it, and we've done it in the past, is to provide project preparation grant, and something that I mentioned earlier in my opening remark also, opening intervention also. But the thing is, how long can an organization such as the EIF continue to provide support of a consultant to enable countries to develop bankable projects? At the end of the day, the capacity has to be built at the country level. The consultants and the international organization helping countries to prepare bankable project may or may not basically transfer the skill and technology required, right? So that sustained capacity will be important, and that's why I emphasize the aspect of capacity building, and this is related to project. But then in the international discussion and deliberation, even in the context of the WTO, the trade environment sustainability structure discussion, or trade and environment subcommittee to discuss and then negotiate various ideas that would be in the interest of LDCs. That also needs a lot of capacity, right, to understand and understand not only the issues but also weigh various scenarios, and then be in a position to sort of make those pointed intervention, and ultimately being able to achieve what they want to achieve in the interest of their countries. So that's another area where it is important. Capacity building is important, but no less important is the aspect of coordination. When we talk about coordination, it's not only the global level coordination. For example, the kind of work that we are doing in order to bring these two groups together to start talking and understanding each other's priorities and position, so that they are able to better articulate their concerns as well as put forth their demand in various multilateral negotiation. I mean, whether it's UNFCCC or at the WTO or elsewhere. That's just one aspect of it, coordination. But at the national level, the kind of coordination that is required is enormous. For example, while countries are preparing their NDCs, nationally determined contribution, are they taking into account trade-related priorities? Are they taking into account the possibility of, of having a paperless trade, regime in place whereby you can reduce, carbon footprint? Or are they, thinking of putting in place some ideas, in order to ensure that smart agriculture practices are adopted and smart value chain practices are adopted? Or some kind of technologies are used. For example, the import liberalization of let's say solar photovoltaic panel, right? So all of these would eventually contribute towards achieving the targets outlined in the NDCs. But there's a bit of a coordination challenge at the country level also. So what we have in place, as EIF at the country level is what is known as National Steering Committee. And this National Steering Committee is the committee that actually decides all the national priorities based on the analytical work that we do at the country level called Diagnostic Trade Integration Study, right? But then we have representatives from, let's say, line ministries such as finance, planning, agriculture, education, and even health ministries are represented in the National Steering Committee because there are trade elements attached to it. But then we don't have the focal ministry that is responsible for climate negotiation as a part of this, National Steering Committee. So this is something in which, we can also do some work. And then, there's a room for improvement in terms of, having active coordination mechanism, both at the country level as well as at the global level. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ratnika. Just to say that the reason I've asked everyone to give one priority is then I know I'll probably just get 2 or 3. Whereas if I asked for 3 to 5, we might get 10, and then where would we be in terms of time? Just to also pick up on one of the points that Ratnika raised about the CDM. For those of you who aren't familiar, that's the clean development mechanism that was agreed under the Kyoto Protocol, whereby countries can trade carbon credits across borders, with the particular aim being that developed countries could pay for emission reductions in developing countries and book that against their own baseline. The controversy around that is firstly that it has been primarily utilized by, as Ratnika said, a handful of major developing countries, Brazil, China, and India, and more problematically, that any emission reductions generated since 2013 are being counted under the new Glasgow Climate Pact going forward, which means that we will not necessarily see quite as many emission reductions as our counting mechanisms might imply, which is obviously, science doesn't care about our accounting choices. Science cares about how much carbon is in the atmosphere. So that is the controversy to which Ratnika alluded. I'm going to turn to Laura and then Jody now to share their one priority. And I wanted to invite them at the same time to start by answering Louis' question in the chat. Particularly, I thought Laura might be able to share more about one of the leading LDC flagships, the LDC Universities Consortium on Climate Change that IIED supports, which is driving a huge amount of the capacity building that Ratnika alluded to. And Jody, when you talk about your one priority, I thought you might also want to update people on the African Continental Free Trade Area, which, though not a solely LDC effort, is a strong Southern effort to build trade in a green way. So over to you, Laura.
Thanks, Sarah, and really good to see these great questions coming into the chat. And I will restrict myself to one priority because I think it would be good to open up to more of these questions. I'm sort of going to build on what Ratnika was saying about coordination, but I think it's actually about coordination in the negotiations. And that's in part what we've been trying to do through this project, link the trade and the climate negotiators together. And we've seen how difficult it is in the run up to COP, particularly having to prepare virtually. It's another one of those things. It has its advantages. You can be sitting in your office or in your home and engaging, but for many of the LDC negotiators, we know they had real problems getting online, getting decent technology. People were negotiating in internet cafes. That's something that isn't quite right. But if we can, through what we've learned from working in the pandemic, link the trade and climate negotiators more, that's when we get to link their agendas better. And also whether there are other forums where the LDCs come together. So it may well be another virtual meeting, but LDC 5 that's due to happen in Doha in Qatar in mid-January. That's an opportunity to bring these agendas together because the focus there is on the support to the least developed countries across the sustainable development agenda, and climate and trade and economic development are absolutely central to those. You asked me to mention the LDC University Consortium. I think when we talk about capacity building, there's still in both the trade and the climate space a sense that there are technologies or ways of doing things in the developed world or even in emerging economies that just need to be transferred to the developing world. Obviously, there needs to be sort of adaptation to the local context, but actually what we're trying to do with the university work is really support local knowledge and local development coming from the grassroots up, if you like. So it's actually building the capacity to think about the ideas locally, to come up with solutions, and it builds on quite a sort of successful stream within international development, where when you give local communities, local organizations, governments the chance to think of things really through from first principles, you can often come up with much more sustainable longer term solutions than something that comes in from outside and you adapt it in the sort of end of the pipe way. So I'll leave it there and look forward to more questions.
Over to you, Jody.
Thank you very much. So yeah, quite hard to nail down to 1 to 2 priorities, but I think the previous speakers have already alluded to this really, and it relates to ensuring that there are structured discussions between the trade and climate communities. So whilst I do feel that, the developments that are taking place amongst WTO members at the current time, that they are talking about trade and environmental sustainability, it's still trade people talking to trade people. It's not trade people talking to climate people, which is precisely what we've tried to achieve with this project. So, that would be my one priority, is that WTO members need to, if you're going to talk about trade and climate, get some climate negotiators in and start having those sorts of structured discussions. I just don't think it's enough that the WTO observes the UNFCCC process and vice versa. There needs to be kind of much more structured and systematic engagement. And, Ratneka has mentioned already that the nationally determined contributions, which are really, at the heart of the Paris Agreement, they're showing how countries are going to adapt to climate change as well as their efforts to mitigate. They have very clear trade-related implications, and yet trade and investment policy is not mainstreamed. So we do have an issue there that does need to be addressed, and I think it can only be addressed through making sure that we, at an institutional level, that these more structured conversations take place. And there are risks if they don't take place. Risks in terms of ensuring that climate finance is additional. This has been a perennial issue for aid for trade. It's likely to become more problematic in the future. And I think that there's an issue, because when you look at where aid for trade resources are going, they're often going to where the kind of priority areas that countries are specifying within their NDCs, the energy sector and infrastructure. So I'd also say that, there's a need perhaps for procedural changes as well. The kind of trade policy review mechanisms that are undertaken by the WTO, their timetables and timelines seem very much out of step now. If we look at the kind of new timetables that have been set for countries' NDCs, and there's going to be this more regular reporting of the efforts that countries are taking to adapt to climate change and mitigate. They have trade-related implications, and yet the WTO trade policy review mechanisms, the timetable is out of sync. So I think trying to better align how the two institutions can work together in a much more structured way is going to be very important. Just coming back to think about NDCs, and as you mentioned, the role of the AFCFTA, I think this is a really important point, because obviously, members can achieve so much through multilateral processes, and you also have, big agreements like the AFCFTA that can also help to support African countries' resilient recovery objectives, as well as their NDCs. And we've seen this through our research. We undertook research looking at 6 African countries. And within that process, we looked at their NDCs and we explored some of the trade-related implications. And again, energy is a big sector. Renewable energy has clear links to environmental goods and services. So, within the AFCFTA, there's an opportunity there to make sure that those sorts of products are not included on sensitive goods lists. And at the continental level, there could also be greater consideration of, what is the list of environmental goods and services that African countries want to prioritise amongst themselves. But I would urge you all to read that report, which will be available on our website if you want further information there. So just to summarise, Sarah, I think it's really, let's try and make sure that the trade community is talking not just amongst itself, but it's engaging in a structured way with the climate community. That would be my number one recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jody. So actually, Jody and I have been trying to do this inside ODI, a trade person talking to a climate person. And after about a year, I understand some of what Jody says. So it does take a bit of time to learn each other's acronyms and ways of thinking, but you can get there. I think it would have been easier had it not been COVID and we could have done it over a glass of wine. But next time we will use that to help with our translation. We have any number of excellent questions in the chat, and I am aware of time constraints. So what I'm going to do is assign questions to our speakers where I know they have some expertise, and cordially invite them to try and have a shot at some of the other questions in the chat where they feel they can answer them. So I hope you feel comfortable with that approach, panelists. If not, I apologize for throwing you in the deep end so wholeheartedly. So firstly, to Ratnika, I wondered if you might be happy tackling the question we have on risk insurance from Mahesh, who asks whether a standalone global mechanism would be able to provide some kind of risk insurance, particularly for LDC priority projects, and help them mobilize some of that private finance. I'll just give you a second to think about that because I know it's in the deep end, and just give Laura a heads up that I wondered whether she might be happy to tackle Sam's question about how developed countries should be coordinating their efforts and joining up to facilitate this outcome for the LDCs where climate and trade come together. And Jody, in our impenetrable jargon-filled chats, we've talked a lot about border carbon adjustment mechanisms, which I think is the focus of Chara's question, and particularly Venezuela's point about unilateral and coercive climate measures with implications for developing countries. We have different perspectives on that, but I'll let you share yours today and the implications there under the WTO. So again, please do feel free, speakers, to respond to any of the other questions in the chat. And again, great questions to everyone who submitted. Would really wish we had the time to dive into some of them in more detail. Over to you, Ratnika.
Yeah, thank you very much. And actually, it's good that you've asked me that question. When Mahesh, put that on the chat box, I thought that, I could potentially, say that as a, it's a great idea. So that's how I wanted to start, Mahesh. So great compliment to you, Mahesh, wherever you are participating from. What we could potentially think of is mechanism. I mean, not only the fact that this is a great idea, because at the end of the day, private sector is there for profit, right? They won't be, just providing support to projects that do not deliver enough return on their investment or enough satisfaction to their shareholders, or or on their bottom line or whatever, right? So therefore, it's important. I think it's a great idea. But then, in terms of mechanism, who should be responsible for that? The World Bank has a separate mechanism, that basically guarantees the political, guarantees against any political risk, right? The MIGA is there. But at the same time, World Bank Group, the IFC and other institutions can come together and discuss with other multilateral institutions, and possibly regional organization, regional development banks such as the African Development Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, and Asian Development Bank could also chip in to develop this mechanism. If there is enough buy-in from LDCs as well as private sector, because this is just an idea, right? At the end of the day, whether the private sector would be interested in, putting money into LDCs just based on the guarantee provided by a particular multilateral institution or not. That's one aspect, right? That's the supply side. Then you have to look at the demand side also, where the LDCs are, willing to sort of, engage in this kind of possible mechanism. I think this is a viable idea worth exploring. So I'll stop at that. I would be happy to discuss follow-up questions in relation to this. Thank you.
Thanks, Ratnika. Over to you, Laura.
Thanks. Just very briefly to sort of follow up on that, I think the issue of insurance is a growing one. And, we saw huge weather events in Europe this summer. We saw small towns in Germany, main streets being washed away. We saw, sadly, people dying in floods. And it was interesting. We were talking to Salim Al-Hook, who unfortunately isn't with us today, and he was saying, what, we in Bangladesh know how to deal with this now. We have, the measures in place to deal with flooding, and we have climate resilience. We could be teaching Europe, North America, Australia, something on this, but actually we still, when it happens, it creates a huge economic problem for our citizens. And this idea of how to design insurance mechanisms that can help at this sort of bit broader level, there's quite a lot of work, I think IID has worked on it in the past, as has ODI, what are the lessons from sort of smallholder insurance that you could sort of build to a greater level? But I'll then go on to the question that you asked me to respond to, Sarah. Yeah, I think there's we've talked for a long time about policy coherence between aid policy and trade policy. I think in terms of trade and climate, there's two kinds of coherence. One is the assistance coherence, which is that aid for trade programs are speaking to climate programs in donors, and that actually there's a joining up there. And that there's also a joining up in terms of thinking about adaptation and resilience, not just a strong focus on mitigation. And that's also what leads into the strong focus on some of the larger polluters across the developing countries. So it's thinking about how to build in into your policy response adaptation and things like loss and damage. And I think there were some interesting developments at COP. For the first time, loss and damage was recognised, and a number of governments, the Scottish hosts, committed to put resources into a fund to deal with that. So that's actually really addressing the adaptation and resilience side of things and putting earmarked resources available for that. And then on adaptation, really helping countries to be able to develop their own plans a little bit, as I was saying before, technology or capacity development, not just coming in from outside. And an initiative IID is involved in the Life AR project, which is working with LDC governments to really help them strengthen their national planning and identify their priorities, which they can then hopefully go to the EIF to get support to build the bankable projects, to then go to the Green Climate Fund or the ICF to get resources, not just that it's money that would have to come from an aid for trade resource. So that kind of linking up developed countries, facilitating that in terms of the resources and the support available, but also in terms of the negotiations.
Thanks, Laura. Over to you, Jody.
Thank you very much. So yes, it's a great question, and I think it really the question really hits on the kind of nail of what we've been trying to achieve with this project. When we first started, we were reflecting on the issues facing LDC graduates within the trade arena, but we weren't really too sure, what the effects of graduation would be in the climate arena. So this is, why we ODI joined forces with IIED to discuss and consider these issues. And then, you've raised the issue of border carbon adjustment measures. And, this really is a new source of trade vulnerability. It's a kind of regulatory effects of climate change. We've got the physical effects that countries will have to adapt to, LDCs will have to adapt to, as well as the regulatory effects. We've still got quite a way to go, I think, to see exactly how the EU's border carbon adjustment measure will be shaped. I think the European Parliament now are looking carefully at it, and there's been proposals for LDC exemptions that have been raised, but we're really yet to see how that will be operationalized. But it's clear that it's not the only. Other players are considering border carbon adjustment measures, and we've also got kind of new supply chain initiatives as well. Reducing the use of ensuring that products that are sourced from deforested land are not included in UK and EU supply chains. So these all have the potential to have knock-on effects. To certain LDC producers. So I think it's kind of incumbent really on trade-related support measures like aid for trade, to be updated and to be ready to adapt, to these new regulatory changes and the effects on producers that are likely. And I think it's this, looking ahead, it's this new kind of trade environment, this new trade landscape that LDCs, forthcoming graduates, will need assistance in adapting to, because it's going to be this combination of both the physical effects are coming, we know they're coming, and then we've also got these different types of regulatory effects that we also know are coming to at some point.
Thank you all for those really thoughtful answers, particularly considering you were thrown into the deep end. I really appreciate how thoroughly you were able to respond to that. We have two outstanding questions in the chat. which I'm going to invite you to kind of raise your hands at if you feel comfortable answering them. The first is from M. Gehring, who was asked about the transition from the clean development mechanism to the sustainable development mechanism under the Paris Agreement. So that's the governance of the global carbon market system, and particularly how the legal transition might look. So give me a wave if you feel comfortable with that. I don't. Looks like none of you do either. So we're very sorry about that. I'm sure there is research online. We haven't seen it and don't know where it is. I feel a bit more confident with the question from Brendan, which is about the dirty business behind net zero, the mining of rare earth metals, copper, and so on. I'm going to invite panelists to jump in a second, but I wanted to make a point first there, which is about the need to think really holistically about what a low carbon transformation looks like, and that it's not always a perfect substitution. So the really obvious example to me is that if we took every car that was currently on the roads and replaced it with an electric car, that alone would take us past 1.5. That is not a solution to the climate crisis because of the energy involved in the manufacturing of those cars, the disposal of the waste, etc. We also need to think there about driving behavioural change in terms of shifts to mass transit, walking, cycling, more compact cities to enable that, the different measures we will need to build some of that transport infrastructure, for example, changing from building with cement and steel to things that are able to be produced in a less carbon intensive way. So there's definitely a story there about new green supply chains. There's also a story about changing the demand end beyond just this perfect substitution of clean technology for dirty technology. Having made that point, I wonder if any of our speakers would like to jump in with observations about how we can support LDCs producing these now increasingly in demand commodities to meet that in a way that also delivers against environmental, social, and governance goals. Give me a wave. Thank you, Jody. Favorite speaker, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really, really pertinent question, and you know, it's also something that not many people think about. You know, they see a Tesla car, but then they don't kind of realize that, you know, the inputs that are in that, you know, amazing looking machine come from, you know, the DRC, you know, often from artisanal miners and so on. So I do think that this is a big challenge, because, you know, it's could potentially means that as the rest of the world moves towards, you know, what seems to be more energy efficient and so on, you know, we've still got LDCs trapped in a different, you know, different product, but it's still the same issues around commodity dependency and so on. So my personal view on this is that you know, I think it's perhaps this sectoral, you know, sector product specific approach. You know, if we've got enhanced due diligence within some types of supply chains for deforested products, you know, why can't we consider that, you know, across different types of commodities, you know, looking ahead, you know, acknowledging that there will be these changes in demand, and, you know, some producers could benefit from that, but only if they're able to get the right institutional frameworks in place. So I do wonder, you know, if there's perhaps more scope for you know, the initiatives around deforested products and so on to perhaps be expanded to kind of capture some of the aspects that Brendan's mentioned in his question. Thank you, Brendan, for joining us as well today. Great question, thanks.
I see Laura's also put up her hand. So Jody is demoted from being solely my favorite speaker, and you're all back being my favorite speakers. Laura, thoughts on Brendan's question?
Thanks. Yeah, I agree. It is a really good question, and it sort of does go to the heart of the bigger sustainable development agenda. I just wanted to share some work that we've just done at IID looking at sort of levers of market transformation. And it is this sort of point about, well, you know, if you're going to have a just transition and you're going to have a greener future, what are the things that you need to be thinking about? DRC, cobalt, child labour, you know, a whole set of very negative issues on the social side. And so actually to say something is greener, it might be, you know, not necessarily browner, but has a much bigger negative social impact. And what we found, we looked at a couple of commodity sectors. We looked at timber, we looked at tropical agricultural commodities, we looked at fisheries, the Marine Stewardship Council, and we saw that transformation was the most successful when you actually brought the stakeholders came together, and stakeholders from consumers to NGOs, businesses and government tended to work in different ways in different sectors. But what was key was when you had an overlap in the agenda. So in our sort of model about, say, electric vehicles, it's consumers recognizing that they have the ability to change markets by either not buying any car and using public transport, or by buying an electric vehicle and asking the questions about where the cobalt in the battery has come from. So that drives transparency down the supply chain. NGOs can play a role. They could be the Greenpeace sort of campaigning, raising people's awareness of the issues, or they could move into being sort of a trusted expert advisor. And something like the Marine Stewardship Council, which looks at sustainable fisheries, that was set up as a coalition between WWF and Unilever, the big food company. And then governments, and often governments have been behind the curve on a lot of these transformations that haven't been driven by regulations. It's sort of businesses have come in coalitions with civil society responding to the market, and then actually only latterly will regulation come in. And we've seen that a little bit in timber with EU regulations, and now these UK regulations around keeping deforestation out of supply chains. So I think there are some interesting examples out there that we could draw on how we can sort of support this transition to be a just transition, and how we get the dirty out of the green in a way that doesn't negatively impact people.
Thanks so much, Laura. And I wanted to pick up on your point there, just to give Ratnika a last chance to speak in response to questions. You talked about this process of a just transition and a sensitivity around how that needs to happen. And Chara's question also speaks to the need to think through the different transition timelines that different actors are going to need. And my sense as a climate rather than a trade person is that the trade architecture does this well with the LDC graduation process, and that the climate architecture is a bit behind on that, in particular around the conversation around net zero. So many of you will have seen after COP that there was a lot of disappointment at India's net zero 2070 target, when actually India's per capita emissions are half the world's average and 1/8 of the average footprint of an American and Australian and so on. And Ratnika, I just wondered if you wanted to jump in there at all and speak about this idea of a just transition and what a time frame might look like for LDCs, for graduates, and for other stakeholders in this as we try and move to this green supply chain, resilient economy vision. Ratnika, you're on mute, but very eloquent.
No, not a problem. So thank you so much, for the question, and it's for the LDCs to decide. For them to decide also, I think they need some kind of capacity building support as to how they would achieve that just transition. Is it only the diagnostic trade integration studies that we do would support this process? Definitely not, because there are other things that are happening when we're talking about a transition. Just transition itself is a complex issue. Then when you add just transition, then there are other dimensions also that need to be sort of looked at, right? So, I mean, when you talk about the transition, it is essentially about, moving away from the sectors that are damaging to sort of, the sectors that are probably more neutral or even positive, that make positive contribution. And then when we talk about that, it's not only the issue of, policies, but also the kind of investment that's required for them to be able to, achieve this transition. So at the end of the day, the public resources in LDCs, and particularly, and this has been highlighted in our paper on finance also, that, because of COVID-19, LDCs are already facing significant fiscal squeeze. And, where will they be able to mobilize the resources from, right? So in that context, I think it will be extremely important for us to tap into other sources of financing. I think Laura touched upon this issue in her earlier remark when she mentioned about, blending as a possible instrument for mobilizing resources in order to help, in these countries in moving away from these sectors which are, considered bad to a relatively good and greener sector, right? So that's one important aspect And that itself, there's a lot of debate that needs to take place at the country level itself. But when it comes to, multilateral level, when we are talking about just transition, the issue of finance, particularly climate finance, and the mechanisms such as Article 6 will, come into play. And it's not only a matter of timeline, it's a matter of, being able to have the right kind of policy in place, right kind of capacity to achieve this, and the financial resources that is required, both from the, country sources, not only the public resources, but also private resources, as well as international sources. And they are also not only private, but also not only public, but also private, and some kind of blended, potential. The mechanisms such as impact investment, now are making forays into these areas by supporting, climate resilient projects, or the project that contribute directly to climate mitigation objectives, as well as some adaptation project as well. So there's a room for for the LDCs to be able to achieve the transition, but then kind of resources that are required can be daunting. So there has to be a kind of multi-stakeholder sort of platform in place at the country level to decide how to put in place the necessary policies, capacity, as well as resources.
Thank you, Ratneka. I think bringing it back to this question of capacity and coordination is really at the heart of the challenge, as you laid out earlier in the conversation today. We're wrapping up at 1:15, wherever you happen to be in the world. And so I wanted to give each of our panelists just 2 minutes more to feedback on what I think has been a really rich conversation, with a lot of very provocative and specific questions in the chat that helped, I think, move this to a place of real detail, and much more focus on the actual changes that we need to see in the world. So Laura, I'm going to start with you, then on to Jody, and give Ratneka the final remarks for the session. Thank you again to all of our audience for your fantastic comments and for joining us today, and to our wonderful speakers. Laura.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. And it's great to see so many people here. And I hope it's not speaking out of turn to say the facilitators who are helping to put these sessions together did tell us at the beginning. We said, how many people are registered? And they said, oh, we don't really know, but other sessions we've done, we've had perhaps 20, 30 participants. We've got double that number. So I think that really highlights how important these issues are and how much interest there is in them. So I hope that this is not sort of the end, like the end of a session, but I hope it's the beginning of a broader conversation, because I think bringing the communities, government, civil society, research, academia, policymakers together across trade and climate is what we actually set out to do with this initial project, with the support from the EIF. And sort of a final sort of comment, picking up on Ratneka's mention of impact finance there, and the LDCs being able to access this finance. Again, ensuring that this doesn't create onerous debt burdens, but then where private finance can come in, where there is an interest in supporting green and inclusive growth, which we're seeing increasingly as the objectives of a number of finance institutions at COP made commitments in this area, that their portfolios would be net zero, that they would be wanting to support sustainability, that with initiatives like the EIF helping the LDCs to come up with initiatives to access that kind of private funding, likely to deliver economic benefits and climate benefits, then that's the kind of thing that we want to see more of going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. So just in terms of final reflections, I think it's just important for us all to bear in mind that the LDCs within the WTO, they are still trying to secure this smooth transition period post-graduation. So they've been trying to secure this for quite some time now, and it's still quite uncertain. So I do hope that, you know, this assignment and drawing attention to the climate change vulnerability aspects, both the physical and the regulatory effects, can perhaps helped sensitize members a bit more as to, you know, considering not just, you know, income per capita, economic indicators, but also considering these environmental vulnerability indicators, of which climate change is going to be, you know, one of the driving forces and factors in the years ahead. I mean, the argument is often levied like, oh, you know, look at Bangladesh. It's a, you know, it's a large country. It's a manufacturing powerhouse, and so on. You know, does it really need 12 years to adapt? Well, you know, Bangladesh is also one of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world. So, you know, that's what we've been trying to draw attention to in this overall project. But, you know, the LDCs as a group still face this challenge of securing a smooth transition. So let's hope the delay in the ministerial conference, you know, can help provide the time necessary, you know, for that agreement to be reached.
Over to you, Ratnaka.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was actually going to mention this very point that Jody mentioned. Let me now pick up on that point and just elaborate a bit further. So you mentioned, Sarah, in your opening remark that, you know, these countries that have graduated have sort of moved a notch up in a way, you know, in terms of not only addressing the income indicator, but also health and education, as well as the economic vulnerability. But, you know, the fact of the matter is that, you know, the graduation criteria, which has three elements to it. I mean, of course, the income is one, economic vulnerability is another, and the human asset index is the third one, right? So countries can graduate if they meet three criteria, but then if they meet two criteria, they can graduate. But, you know, countries can also graduate if they just meet one criteria. So, you know, many countries, I was actually thinking, doing a bit of a count, but then, you know, couldn't get to the exact number. So almost all the Pacific countries that are graduating are only graduating on the basis of their income indicator. So sole criteria, right? And then Angola, for example, you know, Timor-Leste, which has been recommended, but then, you know, might not graduate, you know, anytime soon. Then Equatorial Guinea, which graduated, you know, in 2017. All of them were graduated solely on one criteria. The vulnerability aspect, you know, remains there, right? So, and then vulnerability to climate change is even more significant in the case of these countries in the Pacific, right? When Maldives graduated back in 2011, you know, it had all the vulnerabilities, and because of that, the countries were reluctant, you know, to graduate, including Maldives. You know, after tsunami, they asked for a postponement. So the point is, you know, unless and until these vulnerabilities are addressed, you know, these LDCs, there are chances that these LDCs might again fall back into the into LDC camp, which hasn't happened, but there is a hypothetical possibility, right? So therefore, it is important to build resilience and build capacity of these countries to navigate through all of these complex issues and achieve sustainable graduation. And Jody rightly pointed out the example of Bangladesh being one of those, and Myanmar would have probably, you know, fit into the same category, but it didn't. But then, you know, there are other countries that are vulnerable, and the fact that, and this is also a point that Jody mentioned earlier, that the fact that there is no separate facility or, you know, consideration for LDCs within the discussion on UNFCCC, you know, this is something that needs to change. I hope we can hope for the better. Thanks.
Thank you so very much, Ratnaka, and Jody and Laura, for your fantastic presentations, as echoed by many people in the chat. As we conclude, I wanted to pick up on Ratnaka's point and note that many of the LDCs who have graduated or face the prospect of graduating over recent years Angola, Equatorial Guinea, Timor-Leste are partially able to do so because they have fossil fuel resources that are driving up their increase in income. And I think that finishing on that note really underscores the complexity of the challenge we face, asking LDCs to move their entire macroeconomy to a new climate smart world is graduating from the LDC category was enough of a challenge without facing the need for a net zero carbon pathway and in the face of climate hazards. So this is a huge and urgent challenge, and we look forward to working with all of you as we move forward. Thank you for your time and for your excellent questions.